The journey begins. The year was 1912, and the world was buzzing with excitement. A brand new ship, the RMS Titanic, was ready to set sail on its first voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. The Titanic was not just any ship. It was the largest and most luxurious ship ever built. People called it the Ship of Dreams. It was so big and strong that many believed it was unsinkable. On April 10th, the Titanic was ready to leave from the port of Southampton, England. Thousands of people came to see the ship and wave goodbye to the passengers. Some people were traveling to America to start a new life, while others were going on holiday. The passengers on the Titanic were from all walks of life. Some were very rich, like the wealthy businessman Mr. John Jacob Astor and his young wife. They stayed in the finest first-class cabins, which were like small, beautiful apartments. They had their own private dining rooms, bathrooms, and even a private deck to walk on. Other passengers were not so wealthy. Many families were traveling in third class, where the rooms were smaller and simpler, but they were happy to be on such a grand ship. They dreamed of a better life in America. The third-class passengers shared large rooms with many beds, and they had to share bathrooms with others. But they didn't mind because they were full of hope for the future. As the Titanic slowly moved away from the dock, the passengers waved and cheered. The ship was so large that it felt like a floating city. There were restaurants, a swimming pool, a gym, and even a library. The first-class passengers enjoyed fine dining with the best food and wine, while the third-class passengers made their own fun by singing and dancing together. One of the people on board was a young man named Jack. Jack was an artist, and he had won his ticket to America in a card game. He didn't have much money, but he was full of life and excitement. He spent his days exploring the ship, meeting new people, and sketching pictures of the Titanic. Jack loved talking to everyone he met, from the rich first-class passengers to the hard-working crew members. Another important passenger was Rose. Rose was a young woman from a wealthy family, but she felt trapped by her life. She was engaged to a rich man named Cal, who was handsome but very controlling. Rose didn't love Cal, but she felt she had no choice but to marry him. She felt lonely and unhappy, even though she was surrounded by luxury. Rose spent most of her time sitting quietly, looking out at the endless ocean, and wishing for freedom. As the days passed, Jack and Rose met by chance on the deck of the Titanic. Jack saw that Rose was sad and offered to draw her portrait. Rose was surprised by Jack's kindness and agreed. As Jack sketched, they talked and laughed, and Rose began to feel alive for the first time in a long time. Jack showed her the world from his point of view, a world full of adventure, art, and joy. Rose was amazed by Jack's passion for life. He was not like the other people she knew, who only cared about money and appearances. Jack didn't have much, but he was rich in spirit. He taught Rose to enjoy the simple things in life, like feeling the wind on her face or watching the stars at night. The Titanic sailed smoothly through the cold waters of the Atlantic. The passengers felt safe and comfortable, and they believed nothing could go wrong. The crew was confident as well. They knew the ship was built with the latest technology, and they believed it was unsinkable. But beneath the calm surface of the ocean, danger was lurking. The North Atlantic was full of icebergs huge, floating blocks of ice that could be deadly if a ship hit them. The crew kept a lookout for icebergs, but they didn't worry too much. The Titanic was big and strong, and they believed it could handle anything. As the Titanic sailed farther from land, the weather grew colder and the nights grew darker. The passengers wrapped themselves in warm coats and blankets as they walked on the deck. Jack and Rose spent more time together, growing closer with each passing day. They laughed, talked, and even danced together under the stars. Rose felt happier than she had in years, and Jack was glad to have found a true friend. On the night of April 14th, the Titanic was sailing through a particularly cold part of the Atlantic. The stars shone brightly in the clear sky, and the sea was calm. Most of the passengers had gone to bed, and the ship was quiet. The lookout in the crow's nest was watching the horizon carefully, but he didn't see anything unusual. At around 11:40 p.m., everything changed. The lookout suddenly spotted a large, dark shape ahead. It was an iceberg directly in the path of the Titanic. He rang the bell 3 times and called down to the bridge, "Iceberg, right ahead." The officer on duty, First Officer Murdoch, quickly ordered the ship to turn to avoid the iceberg. The crew tried their best, but the Titanic was too big and moving too fast. The ship turned slightly, but it wasn't enough. The iceberg scraped along the side of the Titanic, tearing a long, jagged hole in the hull below the waterline. At first, the passengers didn't know what had happened. They felt a strange shudder, but the ship seemed to be fine. Some people even joked about the bump in the night. But down below, in the lower parts of the ship, water was pouring in through the hole. The Titanic's designers had said the ship could survive if up to 4 compartments were flooded, but the iceberg had damaged 6. The crew quickly realized that the unthinkable was happening. The Titanic was sinking. The captain, Captain Edward Smith, was called to the bridge. When he saw the damage, his face turned pale. He knew that the Titanic was in serious trouble. He ordered the crew to start waking the passengers and to get the lifeboats ready. But there was a terrible problem. The Titanic didn't have enough lifeboats for everyone on board. There were only 20 lifeboats, enough for about half the people on the ship. As the crew began to lower the lifeboats into the water, panic started to spread. People realized that the ship was sinking, and they rushed to the deck, desperate to find a place in a lifeboat. The crew tried to keep order, but it was difficult. Women and children were told to go first, but many husbands and fathers had to stay behind. Some families refused to be separated choosing to stay together no matter what. Jack and Rose found each other in the chaos. Jack told Rose to get into a lifeboat, but she refused to leave him. She couldn't imagine her life without Jack now. They decided to stay together and try to find a way off the ship. The Titanic was sinking faster and faster. The front of the ship dipped lower into the water, while the back rose higher into the air. The cold sea rushed into the lower decks, and the lights on the ship flickered and went out. In the darkness, the passengers clung to each other, praying for a miracle. But the Titanic was doomed, and everyone on board knew it. The tragic night. As the Titanic continued to sink, the cold Atlantic waters crept higher and higher up the ship. The once majestic vessel was now tilted, its bow submerged deep into the ocean. The air was filled with the sounds of creaking metal, the rushing water, and the panicked cries of the passengers. Jack and Rose knew they had little time left. The lifeboats were quickly filling up, and there were still many people waiting on the deck, hoping for a miracle. Jack grabbed Rose's hand, and they ran toward the back of the ship, where they saw some lifeboats still being lowered. But when they arrived, the lifeboats were already gone, and only a few people were left standing on the deck, shivering in the freezing cold. Rose looked at Jack, her eyes filled with fear. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jack squeezed her hand and tried to stay calm. "We stay together, no matter what," he said. He led Rose toward the railing at the back of the ship, where they could see the dark, icy water below. "When the ship goes under, we have to jump and swim as far away as we can," Jack explained. "The suction could pull us down if we stay too close." Rose nodded, but she was terrified. The water was so cold that even a few minutes in it could be deadly. But she trusted Jack and knew she had to stay strong. Meanwhile, the crew continued to do everything they could to help the passengers. Captain Edward Smith was on the bridge, calmly giving orders, even though he knew the ship was lost. He had served on many ships during his long career, but he had never faced anything like this. He made the heartbreaking decision to go down with the Titanic, knowing that as the captain, it was his duty to stay with his ship until the end. On the lower decks, the crew worked tirelessly to keep the ship's lights on and the pumps running, hoping to buy more time. Many of them knew they would not survive, but they continued to help the passengers in any way they could. Some even gave up their own life jackets to women and children, choosing to sacrifice themselves so that others might live. As the lifeboats were lowered into the water, the passengers inside huddled together, watching in horror as the Titanic slowly disappeared into the sea. They could hear the screams of those still on board and the cries of the people who had already jumped into the freezing water. The night was dark and cold, and the stars shone brightly in the sky, a stark contrast to the chaos below. On the ship, Jack and Rose held onto each other as the water reached the deck. They climbed over the railing, holding on tightly, and waited for the final plunge. Around them, other passengers were doing the same, some praying, others crying, and some simply staring in disbelief at the nightmare unfolding around them. Finally, with a loud groan, the Titanic began to break apart. The massive ship split in two, and the front section quickly sank beneath the waves. The back section, where Jack and Rose were clinging to the railing, tilted even more, rising high into the air before it, too, began to sink. Jack looked into Rose's eyes and said, "Hold on tight, and don't let go. We'll get through this together." As the ship plunged into the water, Jack and Rose jumped. The cold hit them like 1,000 knives, taking their breath away. They struggled to stay afloat, gasping for air as the icy water pulled at them. Around them, other passengers were also fighting for their lives, some managing to stay above the water, while others slipped beneath the waves, overcome by the cold. Jack and Rose swam away from the sinking ship, trying to find something to hold on to. They found a piece of wooden debris floating nearby a door that had come loose from the ship. Jack helped Rose climb onto it, but there was not enough room for both of them. Jack stayed in the water, holding onto the edge of the door, determined to keep Rose safe. "Don't let go, Rose," Jack said, his teeth chattering from the cold. Rose, lying on the door, reached out and held Jack's hand. "I won't," she promised, tears streaming down her face. They both knew the situation was dire, but they refused to give up hope. As the minutes turned into hours, the cold took its toll. Many of the people in the water began to lose consciousness, slipping into the dark, icy depths. The lifeboats, now a short distance away, were filled with survivors, but there was still room for more. Some of the passengers in the lifeboats begged the crew to go back and save those still in the water, but most were too afraid to return, fearing that the desperate people would swamp the boats. Finally, one lifeboat, led by a brave crew member named Harold Lowe, decided to return to the site of the sinking. They carefully rowed back toward the Titanic, searching for survivors. But by the time they arrived, most of the people in the water were gone. The cold had claimed their lives. But Jack and Rose were still holding on. Rose was barely conscious, her body numb from the cold. Jack, too, was fading fast, but he refused to let go of her hand. He knew he had to keep Rose alive, no matter what. When the lifeboat reached them, the crew members quickly pulled Rose out of the water and onto the boat. She was barely alive, her lips blue and her body shaking uncontrollably. They wrapped her in blankets and tried to warm her up. But when they turned to get Jack, it was too late. Jack had slipped beneath the water, his strength finally giving out. He had saved Rose, but he couldn't save himself. Rose, too weak to cry, clutched the blanket around her and stared out at the dark water, knowing that Jack was gone. The lifeboat slowly rowed away, carrying the survivors toward the rescue ship, the RMS Carpathia, which had arrived on the scene. The Carpathia's crew worked tirelessly to pull the survivors from the lifeboats and bring them aboard, giving them warm clothes, food, and medical care. When Rose reached the Carpathia, she was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. She was safe, but her heart was broken. She had lost Jack, the person who had shown her what it meant to truly live. As she sat on the deck of the Carpathia, wrapped in blankets, she made a silent promise to herself. She would live the life that Jack had wanted for her, a life of freedom, adventure, and joy. The Carpathia brought the survivors to New York, where they were met with shock and grief. The world was stunned by the news of the Titanic's sinking. How could the unsinkable ship have gone down? How could so many lives have been lost? The newspapers were filled with stories of the tragedy, and people all over the world mourned the loss of those who had perished. Rose, however, chose to keep her story private. She didn't tell anyone about Jack, not even her family. She kept the memory of him close to her heart, a secret that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. As she stepped off the Carpathia and into the bustling city of New York, she felt a mix of emotions: sadness for what she had lost, but also a sense of hope for the future. In the years that followed, Rose lived the life she had promised Jack. She traveled, explored new places, and found happiness in the simple things. She never forgot the lessons Jack had taught her, and she lived each day with a sense of gratitude for the life she had been given. The story of the Titanic became a legend, a tale of tragedy and heroism that would be told for generations. But for Rose, it was more than just a story. It was a reminder of the love she had found, even in the darkest of times, and the strength that had carried her through. And so, the memory of the Titanic and the love between Jack and Rose lived on, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, even in the face of unimaginable loss.